Exodus 6. God says, I will take these people as my people. That's used elsewhere in the Torah, my friends. And among its other uses, it describes what happens when a man takes a woman to be his wife. By the way, same terminology Yeshua used in the gospel written by Yochanan HaShliach. I will come again and take you to myself. Now, in the context of Exodus 6, then, it appears that God is betrothing Israel to be his wife. And we reflect on that with the Haftorah from the opening Parsha, or portion from the book of Numbers, Hosea 2:19 and 20, which is our meditation when we lay or wrap tefillin. God says, I will betroth you unto me forever, in mercy and loving kindness, and in truthfulness, and so forth. In other words, this is a formal engagement, which then raises the question, if the Exodus is the formal engagement, so when is the wedding? Now, according to traditional Jewish thinking, the rabbis of old remind us that the wedding between God and Israel took place at Mount Sinai. Now, although the biblical text does not specify that a wedding was taking place, the similarities between the phenomena which occurred at Mount Sinai and occur in a traditional Jewish wedding are nevertheless quite striking and instructive. And several of us will get a chance to, in a sense, relive that experience when we go up north for my niece's wedding. And as I conduct that, I will certainly be reminded of our experience tonight. You see, first there was the chuppah, or the canopy. And we see this in Exodus 19:9, when God said, I will come to you in a thick cloud. The cloud, which was a covering, can symbolize the chuppah under which the bride meets the groom. And in fact, in reflecting on the wedding chuppah or canopy, the rabbis point out that it is a reminder of the clouds of glory. Exactly the Exodus 19 experience. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We need to understand something more at this point. And that is, in a Jewish wedding, then, there's a process to go through. First, there's the statement of the intention by the groom, who in this case is our God. And his intentions are stated in that betrothal passage, Exodus 6, 6, and 7. And it's a text which comprise, if you remember Pesach, the 4 I will promises of Passover. So you get your I wills in here. Next, the bride, Israel, is separated in preparation for the wedding. Now, God accomplishes this throughout the Exodus, and then in bringing Israel out into the desert. This began a process of setting her apart. We use the technical term sanctification. It made her unavailable to others, namely Egypt, and it removed outside temptation. And he told Israel then that she would be his prized treasure. Then at the foot of Mount Sinai, the wedding took place. And it began as traditional Jewish weddings do, with a mikveh. All the people were told to wash and to be ready for what was to come. Then came the groom, who was already under the chuppah, the clouds of glory, the wedding canopy, which God had provided with that great cloud over the mountain. And then came the moment they were all waiting for, the exchange of covenant vows and the signing of the wedding contract, the ketubah. This was the 10 words on which all the rest of the Torah is based. The 10 words spoken by God from the cloud to all of Israel. And remember, the text tells us it was literally written or signed by his very finger. And what do the people do? They respond. They say, I do. Next, there was the token of the covenant, corresponding somewhat to the ring in our day. Exodus 31:13, the Veshamru text tells us that this sign is Shabbat. And then it's time for a wedding meal, the festive meal, the covenant meal, Exodus 24, where the leaders of Israel go up to eat with God. And then finally, God begins to make provisions for their living together in a house that they would share. The Mishkan, the tabernacle, followed immediately by the honeymoon in the desert. But wait a second. The desert, isn't that where quote, they refused to obey and didn't pay any attention to the miracles you did for them. Instead, they rebelled and appointed a leader to take them back into slavery in Egypt. By the way, I'm quoting Nehemiah in case you're wondering. But you are a God, Nehemiah 9. You are a God of forgiveness, always ready to pardon, gracious and merciful, slow to become angry, full of love and mercy. That, by the way, is a quotation of Exodus 34, 6 and 7, as God indicated the kind of God he was, the God who gave us the covenant. It goes on to say, Nehemiah does, you didn't abandon them, even though they made a calf idol and proclaimed, this is our God. He brought us out of Egypt. They sinned in so many ways, but in your great mercy you did not abandon them in the wilderness. Instead, the pillar of cloud led them forward day by day, and the pillar of fire showed them the way through the night. Now listen to this. You sent your good spirit to instruct them. Did you catch that? Now, if your theology doesn't allow for that, I am truly sorry. Take it up with Nehemiah. He's the one who said it. You sent your good spirit to instruct them, and you did not stop giving them bread from heaven or water for their thirst. For 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness. They lacked nothing in all that time. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. End quote. In other words, wow. What a honeymoon. Now, the book of Numbers begins by specifying that God spoke with Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting. There's an interesting midrash on this text, which I've shared with you before, but it helps us understand that in the wilderness experience that we're laying the groundwork for. It interprets this verse as indicating the character of God's interaction with Israel on their journeys from Egypt to the Promised Land. And it notes, and I quote, according to the customs of the world, a king of flesh and blood who goes out to the desert, does he find there ease and security just as he would have found in the palace the same food and drink? Answer, not highly likely. Well, except if you visited Herodium and you see what Herod did there, but that's a whole other story. And if you don't understand that reference, then you need to go with us in 2 years when we go back. Yes, that was a commercial in case that went by too quickly for you. Now, you don't expect it. But the Midrash goes on to say, and you were slaves to Egypt. I brought you out of there, and I caused you to rest. There is that text again, Exodus 33, the promise and the Ma'aseh, the campsites. I caused you to rest. Here's what it says, on royal couches, just as it is said, Exodus 13 is now quoted, and God led the people by the way of the wilderness. Stop a second. I'm going to interrupt the Darshan, or the guy who does this Midrashic commentary. Please remember that God is the one who took them into the wilderness. That was his intention for them to go there, which raises the question, how come, God? All right. And so the text asks, and what does "and God led" mean? It means that God caused them to rest, according to the manner of kings, resting on their beds. Where? In the wilderness. You see, God provided for Israel in the wilderness in a way that they could experience life as residents, as it were, in a royal palace. He caused them to rest, according to the manner of kings, on their luxurious beds. And we respond, amazing. So how did God provide in this fashion for our ancestors in the desert? And the Midrash gives us the answers to that. It tells us that we received manna, and we didn't have to struggle for food in the wilderness. Furthermore, the text tells us, the Midrashic text does, that God surrounded Israel with the clouds of glory. These clouds shielded Israel from the desert sun. You know, gang who went to Israel with us, where was that? Where were those clouds when we were up on the side? We could use some of that. Anyhow, I got to get back to the text here. These clouds shielded Israel from the sun and prepared the path for them in the wilderness, removing any obstacles from their way. Moreover, God provided water for Israel to drink in the form of a well or a rock which followed them. It accompanied them on their journeys. That, by the way, is a messianic allusion that is picked up by another rabbi in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, but we don't have the time to get into that. It identifies the rock with the Messiah. So this seemingly redundant reference to God speaking with Moses in the wilderness of Sinai at the beginning of this book of Numbers indicates for us midrashically that God provided for Israel in the wilderness better than even the finest royalty could have expected to receive. And that brings us back to the central image standing behind Sinai the mountain and Sinai the wilderness. It is the image of wedding and honeymoon. And please note this very carefully. This is a significant convergence that our rabbis understood and brought together for us. Shavuot, the holiday, always falls at the beginning of the reading of the book of Numbers. So it's almost as if the text is saying in the book of Numbers that the guests have been counted, they've been numbered. Everyone is seated in their proper place or order because the encampments are described at the beginning of that book. And so the wedding can begin. And please recall, when we celebrate Shavuot here, we draw on the Sephardi and North African customs, which remind us that Shavuot is a reenactment of that wedding and, in fact, a renewal of our vows. It's as if Numbers is saying, it's time for Shavuot. It's time for the wedding. And what happens after the wedding? The honeymoon. In the wilderness. In the wilderness. As Jeremiah, our Haftorah for tonight, as we close this book, reminds us. As the Haftorah for the beginning of the book of Numbers reminded us in Hosea. I have betrothed you to me forever. As we were reminded by the fact that our shoes and our clothes did not wear out. As both Deuteronomy and Nehemiah reminded us. And as this midrash that I've shared with you, this commentary on the text,